Want a chance to win £250 in vouchers? All you have to do is fill out the Ballpark's listener survey. It takes just 15 minutes. The Ballpark podcast is celebrating our 10th anniversary in 2026. And after more than 130 episodes covering U.S. politics, we want to hear from you to shape our next decade. So hit the link in the show notes for the survey details and prize draw terms and conditions. Share your thoughts, and you could be £250 better off.
Hello and welcome to The Ballpark, a podcast from the Phelan US Centre here at the London School of Economics. I'm Chris Gilson, Managing Editor of the Phelan US Centre's blog on US politics and policy, USAP. In June 2026, the International Labour Organization adopted Convention number 193, a labour standard dedicated specifically to protecting the rights of those working in the platform economy. This includes a large portion of so-called gig economy workers, such as delivery drivers, freelancers, and cleaners. The adoption of the ILO Convention reflected, among other things, the rise of artificial intelligence as a crucial element of the workplace of the gig economy. From helping assign tasks and determining prices on delivery and rideshare platforms to recommending certain individuals over others on freelance hiring sites, AI is fast becoming a core part of the modern gig economy. Yet even as companies continue to explore the possibilities unlocked by greater AI integration, many commentators both within and outside the gig economy have expressed concerns with the negative consequences of automation in an industry where people are so important. These fears range from algorithmic transparency to exploitative pricing and unequal employment rights. Yet, the concerns have so far remained largely unaddressed by governments and organizations. To discuss the issues surrounding AI and the gig economy, in June 2026, I spoke with Lindsey Cameron, Assistant Professor of Management and the Dorinda and Mark Winkelman Distinguished Faculty Scholar at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. I began our conversation by asking Professor Cameron to outline her research and current work.
Thank you so much for having me on this show. I'm Lindsey Cameron. I'm Assistant Professor of Management and Sociology at the Wharton School at University of Pennsylvania. And I primarily look at the gig economy. So all those little apps you can find on your phone, Instacart, DoorDash, Uber. And I really look at it from the worker's perspective and how do they interact when they have an algorithm as their boss and not a human.
Thank you so much. So as you said, your work is focused on algorithmic management in the workplace. But for those who might not be familiar with that term, what it means, can you talk us through what it is and how and where people might recognize it? How might they have seen it in their daily lives?
So the thing is, when algorithmic management is done so well, you don't even know that it's running there in the background. So when you look at it in terms from an Uber driver's perspective, it's who's doing the hiring, the firing, evaluating your work, determining how much you're getting paid. I worked on and off as an Uber driver for 3 years, and I never talked to a single Uber employee. It was the algorithm that was my boss. In terms to the way this might affect, you see algorithmic management in other lines of work, it could be you working at a retail store and it tells you what shifts you're supposed to come in. An algorithm has calculated when there's demand. It could be there's a lot of surveillance technology so much now in the white-collar workplace to make sure you're not saying words that are classified or potentially sensitive words. Or are you talking to someone at the institute where you don't normally talk to? And does that signal something? You can imagine if you're in a biotech firm, that might signal why is information crossing these boundaries that we think should be strictly segregated. And that monitoring can then trip up something or get trickled up through the chain of command and then be used as a management tool, as surveillance, as what is the warmth and quality of tone in your emails if you're writing to people as customer servants agents. So there are all these ways where algorithmic management in different ways shapes our everyday world and work in ways we may not even know.
Thank you. And just to kind of expand on that a little bit, how are people reacting to this algorithmic management in terms of thinking about maybe kind of the self-surveillance they have to give themselves if they do even know this is happening? What does that mean for the way people are working, the way they're thinking about their work?
It's interesting that there's a disconnect. If you read an article in Wired or Dissent or Logic, they have a very critical view of this surveillance that individuals and workers are over and about erosion of privacy. How is it that you can talk to your friend about gummy bears and then 2 hours later, Amazon is feeding you ads for gummy bears? There is that kind of concern. But I think that's what those types of articles really point at and critique. I think, though, for the average worker, the average American, it is not top of mind. Nate Fass has done some really great work on this, where you just become so comfortable with this idea that you have limited privacy, or that there's always this sort of in the background humming surveillance or algorithmic management, that you just become accustomed to it. How many times do we go into a doctor's office and you have to sign a consent form that's letting you know their data is going to be monitored or is going to some other database? Who actually doesn't sign that form? It's very few people. Alex Rosenblatt just wrote a piece about this, about when she tried not to sign these forms, how it was very hard for her to even get medical care because they didn't even have a procedure set up of what would you do if you didn't sign this form. So all of this, what I'm trying to get to this point is there are a fair amount of people who are calling attention to the hyper surveillance and the hyper rationalization that comes with algorithmic management and surveillance. But I think the majority of people are just becoming used to it.
And from sort of, I guess, the managerial, the employer's point of view, they're using these algorithms to get better performance. Is that right? Or is it just more about control? Why are they doing this? Is it for better profits?
All these things are very strongly linked. The ultimate level, I'd say it's about control. But I don't mean control is, if you don't do X, Chris, I'm going to hit you over the head. Because you can't control people just by sticks. They're going to be like, you're abusing me and I'm going to run away and we're going to make unions and fight for our collective benefit. So one of the most powerful ways to control an individual is through giving them carrots, to letting them feel like they have a sense of agency or freedom in the work. And this is really what the on-demand gig economy promises. The algorithm will tell you the best time to sign on so you can make the most money. We calculate supply and demand, so we're going to give you a really good fare to do this ride now, or we'll know when to give you bonuses to incentivize you. So workers will feel like they have a fair amount of autonomy coming into a system like that, but that allows the system to control them even more deeply.
And just so our listeners are clear, these algorithms, this algorithmic measure, it's not necessarily AI, is it? Because it's been around for quite a while. It doesn't have to be AI, does it?
If you do read, I think it's Tarleton Gillespie. He's one of the founders of looking at sort of this more critical, sociological, anthropological look at algorithms. An algorithm is like those old things you look, what's the abacus, where you're moving around little tiles. It's a set of computational code, and not code as we think about as programming. Do A, B, then C comes out. So if you wanted to go through that argument, you'd be like, algorithms have existed since 400 BC or whatever. But to get to your very specific question, how I think you meant it, I mean, there is a ton of hype and interest, rightly so, about generative AI and how it's pushing our knowledge and weight and how we think. But there's also predictive AI. And that's essentially what algorithmic management is. It's a form of predictive AI.
Building on my earlier question, could you talk about how some of the older algorithmic management has been kind of morphed into AI management for gig workers and how that's changed? You said, for example, you didn't meet a person when you were working for Uber. Is AI replacing managers in terms of the algorithm for gig workers?
One answer I could give is, I'm thinking about, there's been a lot of press and also some lawsuits about there being sexual assaults in Uber vehicles. And there's a question about how much could Uber predict there will be a sexual assault in a vehicle. If it's late at night and it's Saturday and they're picking up at a bar and it's a man that's picking up a woman and this man has a low rating or a history of complaints against him. That's a really good example about predictive AI, about how they're able to use that to decide, well, should I match these two people together or should I match another person together? So I think that's a nice example about how we're able to use technology to make the gig economy and work safer.
Can you talk about the effects of either AI or just algorithmic management more generally on people who work in the gig economy in terms of how that is running their work and potentially their lives? Any kinds of risks or concerns that people might have for gig economy workers as AI becomes more prevalent?
So the example I shared before, I think, is actually a positive example of where we can use that technology to make rides safer. And you could think of natural extensions about what type of delivery driver might be safer for them to go to one store or one neighborhood or deliver in one area, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this positive perspective is different than most of the research we've seen from the gig economy so far, because most of the research has focused on this sort of race to the bottom with wages. If I know you normally need to work 80 hours a week and you're going to get $600 and then you sign off because maybe that's what you need to pay your utilities and some other sort of bill that month, The algorithm kind of knows your behavior, and maybe they'll give you shorter rides that don't add up as quickly, but they can keep you on the clock longer. They'll do some sort of predictive planning about how to optimize their routes based on your behavior. So what you have from there are social scientists like Bina Dubal, who's at UC Irvine, talk about algorithmic wage discrimination because you have all this information about your employer. And that is fair. And there is a lot of research that's sort of talking about the negative repercussions for workers because of the depth of the algorithmic management, the intensification that allows the quantification of the work. And that is all true. And that has been a main part of this research. But I think there's some other examples I've been giving you about the sexual assault that shows another side of that could happen.
Is there any potential for discrimination or bias to come through for the use of AI and algorithms in terms of thinking about deciding which customers to pick up or who's at risk, and that being based on bias?
That was some pretty fundamental research that came out in the gig economy, I think 2016, 2017. So I'm thinking it might have been Edelman. He was at HBS, and then also Hannock, Hannack, 2017. And the Edelman story looks at, I think, Airbnb. I think Hannock looks at maybe past like a Fiverr sort of company. I think they both find that people of color tend to get lower ratings on this platform. I think they argue theoretically it's about human biases against sort of minority groups or gender groups. But then when your rating is used to determine, well, what offer are you going to be presented? What ride are you going to get next? Or where in the search results your apartment will be presented at Airbnb. And so there is a question that you're getting at about, yes, ratings, while we think they're quantifiable and hence objective, they are in fact not. And that's one of the ways that you get these sort of trickle down is not the right word. I call them ghost variables in a paper, that how ghost variables about race, immigration status, caste, gender affect work in the gig economy. Because we tend to think of it really only from a labor lens, but with humans doing these evaluations, and of course these evaluative algorithmic systems not writing themselves, there can always be discrimination programmed within.
And once that's sort of hard-coded in, you have to take it out or replace it, don't you? Because people with biases are creating them. They're inputting those biases, aren't they?
I agree. That is one way to look at it through the rating system. There are other ways people have looked at it. Thinking about Niels van Doorn, he does research on migrant food delivery drivers in Europe, because in Europe, most of them tend to be migrants. And he talks a lot about the precarity of their immigration status and then the precarity of this type of work and how it actually feeds one another. Both of them can, well, if I'm really not entirely sure about can I stay in this country, but I really need income, well, I'll be willing to set these types of circumstances for their work. And then, of course, that'll have a play of how the algorithm system is sort of doling out tasks and at what rates and et cetera. So I think there's lots of ways that there can be bias or discrimination is not the right word, but how these social variables affect these technical systems and vice versa.
And now thinking about the impact, so obviously AI has had a big impact on the gig economy. Has that differed at all from anything we've seen with other economic sectors in terms of that relationship?
There's a saying we have in the States. It's called the canary in the coal mine. And it's back in the olden days before we had technology to monitor the quality in mines and air shafts. You put a canary in. If the canary dies, you're like, aha, because they have smaller lungs, smaller hearts. The air is not good. And we humans need to get out of here. So when you think about a lot of these technical tools, they're often tested and perfected on the most marginalized part of the population first, because they're the ones who are going to have the least voice. And so you can sort of go and experiment. And I mean, I'm not the first person to say this. Sophia Noble has written quite about this. The woman who wrote the book, Weapons of Mass Destruction, Ruha Benjamin at Princeton, have talked about this idea. So when we talk about the gig economy as being this predictive AI, like the first testing of what's it like to have this technology so deeply embedded in the labor process, that's how I see the gig economy. It was the canary in the coal mine for this proof of concept. How can we have algorithms manage workers? All right, then. And now we're going to do content moderation by algorithms. And now we don't need paralegals anymore, copy editors. Let's see how much of this we can have predictive and generative AI do these together. So that's how I see this as sort of a period of evolution that we're sort of living through and watching right now.
A question for you. Have you filled out the Ballpark survey yet? It's just 15 minutes, helps us get ready for our 10th anniversary, and if you're lucky, you might win £250 in vouchers.
And how do you see this unfolding then in the next decade or so in terms of will workers react to this by forming stronger unions, or will the algorithmic tools get better or get more submerged potentially and therefore they'll be harder to spot? Where do you think these things are going? I mean, if it's starting out with a gig economy, where is it going next? Will these sectors sort of accept it or be able to resist it?
So I love to tell you some positive story about, there's the beginning of these union-like organizations or collective representation that's been happening all across the country, in Massachusetts and Seattle. But I would say while those things are happening, true, yes, it's gotten easier and easier to get almost anything you want through an app. There's a company called Swimply. It's like Airbnb for pools, and you can just rent somebody's swimming pool for 2 to 3 hours. So that being said, I don't think the appetite for these types of app-based on-demand services are going away, particularly as people are feeling more crunched with time. They're going to want to outsource as much as possible. Now, I think there will be some technical changes. Even here in downtown Philadelphia, I see these little robot machines going down my street delivering Uber Eats or some sort of food delivery is stamped on the side of it. So there is a way there will be some automation that'll be coming in to augment. But I don't think the drones are going to be delivering our Amazon packages anytime soon. They've been talking about that. They do blood delivery in certain areas of the U.S. and sub-Saharan Africa. But no, I don't think our Amazon packages would make the airspace too crowded. So the point of what I'm trying to say is that I do not think there will be an Uberification of this entire society. That was sort of like the early days, like the end of employment as we know it. There will be an Uber for everything. It's never going to become that frictionless, the technology. But I do think we're sort of in a maturing stage where it's going to continue to grow, but not at an exponential point because we've become accustomed to it. It's become very embedded in the society. And that's the way the tech companies ideally would like it to be because they can say they've done market capture once we've become dependent on it. And then they can slowly start raising the prices so they can become more profitable.
I'm thinking now about the role of governments, and I think companies too. Have there been any policies you've seen by governments, especially in the US or state governments, and even the companies themselves or other groups, to manage the use of algorithms and AI in the gig economy and more generally?
The answer I think I'll try to give is that there's been a shift in the gig economy and that I would say for the first 8 to 9 years, it was all about employment classification cases. Are they employees or are they independent contractors? Which at the core goes to, is the algorithm really your boss or not? And I think there have been a few decisive cases or cases that have settled that have mostly resolved that issue in the United States. The cases have looked different in different countries. Certain countries are classified as employees. In certain countries, they're definitely independent contractors. In other countries, there's a third party where people have to rent their vehicles from. And when I mean Uber here, I'm not so much trying to talk. It's just because Uber is the first company, the biggest one. It gets a lot of the heat because it's the first mover, but it has implications for everything else in the gig economy. I think the questions you're asking about legal things and the AI tend to be a different set of conversations. Really about privacy and how data is being shared and how long can you keep the data and can you train the data. And Alondra Nelson, who's at the Institute for Advanced Studies, who was previously in the Science and Technology Office under the Biden administration. So I read a lot of her work where she looks at it. But what I'm trying to say is these are two different conversations, is what I've been saying for right now. And the question is, will they remain two different conversations? I don't know. I think the only way where I've been seeing some way people are tying it together is thinking about issues of liability might be where we see these two issues converge.
So what should people who use or interact with the gig economy keep in mind when it comes to AI and the role of AI in that?
I would just have a sense, I think curiosity is too benign of the word. I think skepticism is the idea I'm thinking about. Are you really paying the fair market rate to get that cupcake delivered from you from 20 minutes away? You just bought one cupcake and they're charging you X amount. I think there's a questioning I'm always thinking about. Is this really the fair price? How much of this is actually getting to the worker? It's probably less than whatever you think it's going to be. And then, of course, that inclines me to tip even more generously. But I think there's just a question of what can you not see that's allowing this transaction to happen? And then this question I always have, what is the actual market value? Because some of these companies will offer you to be part of a discount program if you're a frequent shopper or a frequent rider. And I'm always curious about, well, how do I know if I'm really getting a discount though when the prices are set in real time by an algorithm? Who's actually winning here? What is actually happening here? And I don't think we can actually know the answer. And as researchers, we're kind of like all touching an elephant and grabbing different parts, trying to think, we think it works a little bit with whether or not you're an immigrant, or about race, or is it about this is predictive AI and it's a bit different from generative. Like, we're all trying to figure out how this big economy is shaping and moving. And it's hard. It's also impossible to hold the whole picture. And so when you're to your question about what should the listeners keep into mind, I think for me, there's skepticism, there is wonderment of how it's working, and it's really just not as simple as clicking a button and having your food delivered. So there's also a bit of awe that I have, awe that this is all working.
So just before we finish, I'd like to give you the opportunity to direct our listeners' attention to what you're working on right now, or any recent or upcoming articles, books, projects you're working on that you think they might find to be of interest, or indeed any work from other folks that you think they might find to be of interest in this sort of area.
Thank you so much for the offer. So in terms of some of my work that I'm working on, it's about the ride-hailing industry in the global south. I'm looking at Nigeria, Ghana, and Brazil. And of course, there, you don't just press a button and a car shows up. I mean, you might have 50 streets with the same name in them, or could be monsoon season and the GPS isn't working very well. So I look at all these workarounds that these drivers have to do to compensate for the fact that technology is not frictionless in the same way that it is in the States. That's something I'm really excited about, because this type of labor, there's a way of which it brings a lot of benefits to countries where the economy is not as formalized. And there's a lot of ways where these are mostly informal economies. So there's a lot of indigenous know-how how to get things done. And that is really what supports these apps working well. In terms of other people's work, I've mentioned so many people on the call: Ruha Benjamin, Alondra Nelson, Kathy O'Neill is the author of Weapons of Mass Destruction. And also Maura Weigel, she's a comparative literature professor. She studies the contemporary digital economy at Harvard. She's also done really interesting work on misinformation and Amazon in China. So those are just a few ideas out there in case your listeners want to go deeper.
Thank you so much. We'll be linking to all those names and those folks' work as well in our show notes. Just remains for me to say, Professor Lindsey Cameron, thank you so much for speaking to the Ballpark today.
Thank you.
Lindsey Cameron is Assistant Professor of Management and the Dorinda and Mark Winkleman Distinguished Faculty Scholar at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. And that's it for this episode of the Ballpark's mini-series on AI in the US. Thanks so much to Professor Lindsey Cameron for joining us in this episode. For more information about the Phelan US Centre, you can go to www.lse.ic.uk/United-States. On X and Instagram, we're at LSE_US, and on LinkedIn, we're LSE United States. This episode of The Ballpark was produced by Chris Kilson and Avan Fatah. Our theme tune is by Ranger and the Rearrangers, a Seattle-based gypsy jazz band. You can look them up at rangerswings.com. To listen to all our previous episodes, including more from our mini-series on AI in the US, just enter LSE Ballpark into your search engine of choice. You'll find us. We're free to listen to, and like lots of other podcasts, we're ad-free. We'd love to hear what you think about the show. You can email us any feedback at uscenter@lse.ac.uk, or you can send us a tweet at LSE_US. And tell your friends about us. If you like what you've heard, then please rate and review us via your podcast platform. It helps other people find the show. The content and opinions expressed in this podcast do not reflect those of the Phelan US Centre or the London School of Economics. Thanks for listening.
Play ball!